I was just a leech living off my father's generosity, and from this day on, I wouldn't see a single dime. My brother-in-law sneered those exact words through the phone, his voice dripping with triumphant malice, while my sister audibly wept in the background, a theatrical, practiced sob. She had called me at 6 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday, her voice trembling as she delivered the devastating news. Dad had passed away suddenly in his sleep during the night. Before I could even process the words, before a single tear could form, my brother-in-law snatched the phone to inform me that Dad's entire estate, including the family business, the waterfront property, and all liquid assets, had been legally bequeathed solely to their marriage. I was completely cut out. Finished. The silence in the room was deafening. But that's not where this story began. 3 months earlier, I was working 60 hours a week as the chief operational strategist for my family's commercial real estate firm. I had spent the last 7 years grinding in the background, modernizing the infrastructure, securing key municipal contracts, and building relationships with high-profile investors. To the outside world, however, I was just the quiet daughter who stayed out of the spotlight. My sister, on the other hand, was a master of appearances. She married a man whose ambition was matched only by his absolute incompetence. Together, they cultivated an image of high society success, funding a lavish lifestyle of private jets, designer wardrobes, and relentless social media flexing. The problem was none of it was funded by them. They were bleeding cash, buried in hidden debt, and desperately trying to project an aura of untouchable wealth. My brother-in-law hated me. He couldn't stand that I understood the numbers, that I saw right through his slick suits and empty corporate jargon. Every family dinner was a battlefield of passive-aggressive jabs. He would loudly lecture the table about true leadership while making dismissive comments about my role, labeling me a gloriously overpaid clerk. Some people are built to lead companies, and some are just built to take notes, he'd say with a smirk, swirling his vintage wine. Isn't that right? I never argued. I never raised my voice or defended myself. I simply smiled, took a sip of my water, and stayed calm. Let them think I was weak. Let them believe I was helpless. You see, my brother-in-law believed he was the ultimate master manipulator. He spent months whispering in the ears of our board members, spreading subtle rumors that my father was suffering from cognitive decline and that I was enabling it to quietly siphon company funds. He played the dutiful, concerned son-in-law to perfection. He was arrogant, condescending, and utterly convinced he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. He truly believed he was untouchable. He had no idea what was coming. What my sister and her husband didn't know, what nobody in our inner circle knew, was the true nature of my father's business structure. They saw a booming real estate empire and assumed my father was the sole puppet master. They didn't realize that 4 years ago, when the company faced a massive restructuring, it was my personal capital, saved from early tech investments, that saved the firm from bankruptcy. In exchange, my father and I executed a private, legally binding corporate restructuring. I wasn't just an employee. I was the majority equity holder with a 51% controlling stake, held under a private master holding entity. Furthermore, Dad had signed a legal irrevocable power of attorney assigning me total administrative authority in the event of any attempt to hostilely seize corporate assets. Dad and I kept this completely secret. We wanted to see who in our circle was truly loyal and who was waiting for an opportunity to strike. Remember that detail. It matters later. Over the next few weeks, the escalation was relentless. My brother-in-law began calling emergency meetings behind my back, trying to convince key executives to vote me off the operational board. He openly mocked my work in front of staff, handed my key accounts over to his unqualified friends, and even tried to restrict my access to the central corporate servers. Every time he pushed, I stepped back. Every time he insulted me, I documented it. The more ground I surrendered, the bolder he became. He mistook my silence for fear, completely unaware that he was marching straight into a trap of his own making. Then came the point of no return. The day before that infamous early morning phone call, my father abruptly announced he was taking a quiet, off-grid weekend at my private cabin in the mountains to rest. My brother-in-law saw his golden opportunity. Believing Dad was isolated, out of reach, and vulnerable, he executed a forged emergency amendment to my father's living trust, a sloppy, desperate document claiming Dad had transferred all personal and corporate assets to my sister and him. They thought Dad was alone at his estate, They thought he was isolated. They were so blinded by greed that they didn't even bother to verify if he was actually in the house before launching their plan. They immediately initiated a legal freeze on what they thought were my father's primary accounts, preparing to announce their takeover at an emergency board meeting scheduled for noon that day. They had just ruined themselves. Which brings us back to that Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. Dad died in his sleep and you have nothing, my brother-in-law sneered through the phone. Don't bother showing up to the office today. Security already has your picture. You're finished. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. Instead, I pressed the speakerphone button on my cell phone and set it on the kitchen island. Sitting right beside me, holding a steaming mug of black coffee and wearing a cozy flannel shirt, was my father. He wasn't dead. He was very much alive, perfectly healthy, and listening to every single word. My father leaned closer to the phone, his face hardening into a look of absolute icy disgust. Is that right? Dad's voice boomed through the speaker, crisp, powerful, and unmistakably alive. The silence on the other end of the line was instant and suffocating. The theatrical sobbing instantly stopped. You could practically hear the air being sucked out of the room 300 miles away. "Dad?" my sister stammered, her voice dropping 3 octaves, suddenly breathless. You're alive?" "Extremely alive," Dad said calmly, taking a slow sip of his coffee, and listening to my son-in-law celebrate my death while trying to steal a company he didn't build. "Dad, wait. It's a mistake. We thought," my brother-in-law began, his arrogant composure instantly shattering into stammering, pathetic panic. "Save it," Dad interrupted. "We'll talk at the noon board meeting. Bring your lawyers. You're going to need them." Dad hung up the phone. Nobody in that house slept for the rest of the morning. At precisely 12 p.m., my sister and her husband walked into the corporate skyscraper boardroom. They looked pale, sick, and completely shattered, desperately trying to construct a lie to save themselves. The entire board of directors was seated around the long oak table, along with 3 men in sharp black suits sitting in the back corner. My brother-in-law tried to immediately take the head chair, launching into a nervous, rambling speech. "Look, everyone, there was a massive miscommunication this morning. A tragic misunderstanding regarding trust documents." I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and tapped a leather folder against the wood. "There's no misunderstanding," I said smoothly, "and you can step away from that chair." "You don't tell me what to do," he snapped, a flash of his old arrogance flaring up in a desperate last stand. "You're just an employee here. Dad might be alive, but the trust structure gives us." "The trust structure is irrelevant," I interrupted, opening the folder. This was the reveal. I handed identical legal briefs to every board member. "You are looking at the master ownership filings of the parent holding corporation. I hold 51% controlling interest in this entire enterprise, and have for 4 years. My father holds 49%. You, brother-in-law, hold 0. Gasps echoed around the room. Dropped pens clattered onto the glass table. Board members leaned forward, wide-eyed, staring at the undeniable state seals on the documents. My brother-in-law's face went completely ghostly white. He gripped the back of a chair just to stay upright. "Furthermore," I continued, gesturing to the men in black suits at the back of the room, "these gentlemen are forensic investigators from the State Financial Crimes Division. While you were busy forging trust documents this weekend, we submitted 6 months of bank records proving you've been embezzling corporate funds to cover your personal debts." The revenge cascade was absolute and immediate. Security entered the room less than 2 minutes later. My brother-in-law was escorted out of the building in handcuffs in front of the entire staff, his tearful pleas echoing down the glass hallway. Within 48 hours, my sister filed for emergency divorce in a desperate attempt to distance herself from his impending federal fraud charges, but the financial audit revealed she was complicit. Their lavish home, cars, and assets were seized to satisfy the debt. Neither of them retained a single cent. The social standing they had sacrificed their souls to build disintegrated overnight, replaced by public humiliation and criminal indictments. As for me, I didn't celebrate wildly. I didn't throw a party or gloat. When the police cars pulled away from the corporate headquarters, I simply walked back to my office, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat down at my desk. I pulled up the company's Q3 growth strategies, took a deep breath, and got straight back to work. I gained complete control of the company, protected my father's legacy, and finally achieved total, undisturbed peace. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with? Tell me your story in the comments.